Another day, another Z8 comparison video for you, this time with the D850. A lot of D850 users have said to us, is the Z8 really the camera for me now? Is it my time to shine, my time to go mirrorless?
Well, here we are to answer all your questions. Let's start with the size and weight.
Yeah, so the D850 is 1,005 grams with the battery in it, so just over a kilo, while the Z8 is 910 grams, so you do save a bit of weight there.
I mean, in a real life, in a hand, it does feel a tiny bit lighter, but I don't think that you'll notice a massive difference between the two.
No, where you will see a difference though is with the lenses. The Z lenses, even in the Pro 2.8 range, are considerably lighter than the F-mount equivalent. So if you're a 2.8 trilogy user, you are saving a good few hundred grams, at least 100 on each lens if you've got a 14-24, 24-70 and a 70-200.
Oh, easily. Look at the 14-24. 14-24 is about a kilo on F mount and it's about 600 grams on the Z mount, which is incredible saving in terms of weight and size.
Yeah, with no image compromise at all. So
or actually improvement.
Yeah, exactly. It's even better. Both of them take the same battery, so in terms of the weight saving there, it's much the same. Obviously, there's a new optimized version in the Z8 that you can charge in camera.
That's true. So for some of you who are upgrading from D850 to Z8 and got a bunch of spare batteries, yes, you can use them in the Z8. However, the quantity of shots is going to be less compared to the recent ENL15C battery. So usable, but with less shots per charge.
That's right. You also won't be able to charge those older batteries inside the Z8. The Z8 will charge your ENL15C batteries in camera, no problem. For all older batteries, you will have to charge them in the MH25A charger, which is supplied with the Z8.
That's true. The good news is, obviously, it is supplied in the box, and if you have a spare one, you can have two batteries charging at the same time. Who knows? But with the cameras like Z8 and Z9, you can simply plug it into USB socket and then just leave the battery charging inside the camera, which is nice, just like charging your phone.
If we talk about aesthetics here, then obviously both cameras are still very much Nikon. There is a slightly different feel to the D850 over the Z8. I'd say the grip is slightly more ergonomic with the Z8. It's a bit more curved in, but some people like that chunkier hold on the D850.
I do prefer D850. Just feel in hand over Z8, but again, they're very close to each other.
Yeah, now you can see that the D850 is a bit taller than the Z8 and it's a bit thicker too on the base. You can add an optional battery pack to both of these cameras. We'll talk about the differences between those a little bit later, but you can then add a portrait orientation grip to the bottom of either one. With this one, it is the MBD12, and with that, the MBN12.
The infamous MBN12. Now let's talk about LCD screens a little bit. Both cameras have tilted screens. Both of them are slightly different. Now the LCD screen, while tilted on D850, it's only got 2 axes, while the Z8 screen also go a 3rd axis as well, so which allows you to shoot in a portrait mode, which makes life easier for some portrait photographers, I would say.
Yeah.
It's a higher resolution LCD as well, so your images will look sharp and crisp on the back of the camera. Now, the screen on D850 though is still really, really good. We're not in the age of mobile phones where they first came out and they were all pixelated and we saw a huge improvement with this generation. No, it's really, really good. I would say it's on par with this. However, of course, Z8 LCD is higher quality.
Yes. Now looking at the viewfinder, obviously with the D850, you've got an optical viewfinder because you have a mirror. This is probably one of the nicest, brightest DSLR viewfinders available out there, I would say, and it has a very, very good reputation. However, just from looking through the viewfinder, the Z8 viewfinder, even though it's electronic, feels bigger. That probably has something to do with the fact that it's mirrorless.
Once you get over the initial shock of using the electronic viewfinder over optical viewfinder, there's a lot of benefits of having an electronic viewfinder in the camera over optical viewfinder. For example, you get what you see, you can set up an actual exposure in the viewfinder compared to, obviously, with this one, you just see through the lens, so there's no actual exposure settings. Autofocus is designed differently around the sensor this time. There's no blackout with cameras like Z8 and Z9. And since autofocus system is designed slightly different, there's actually no sensor under the mirror. It's actually the autofocus system is on the sensor. Technically, the images you will get will be sharper compared to DSLR.
Yes, to go a little bit nerdy on you, when the high-resolution cameras first came out, it was noticed that pictures would be sharper if you focused using live view, because you were focusing directly onto the sensor, than if you were using the optical viewfinder. Obviously, with a camera like a Z8, that isn't an issue. You are always focusing straight onto the sensor, so you'll get the sharpest images you possibly can.
Just to expand on that, a lot of users of D850 use autofocus fine-tune feature on those cameras just to get this extra maybe 1% of sharpness out of the cameras. With the mirrorless cameras, generally they're spot on. There's very little adjustment you need to do in terms of fine-tuning of the lenses. Both cameras have a 10-pin sockets. However, the D850 has a PC flash sync socket, which Z8 doesn't have. Now, for some of you who use cables to trigger their studio flash guns, you can buy a Nikon AS15, a hot shoe PC sync adapter, and put it on top of the camera. A lot of people are shooting wireless nowadays, so a lot of people won't find it an issue. Now, talking about the memory cards, both surprisingly take CF Express cards as well as D cards. Obviously, XQD cards will fit. Now, keep in mind that because Z8 is much newer camera, it will take much faster cards, and in terms of this, it can record onto those cards much faster compared to D850, and that's just to do with the time the camera's been released. This been released quite some time ago, while this is a new product on the block, but for fast shooters, for people who need high frame rates, you will definitely notice the difference between the two cameras just based on that tech.
Let's talk about the sensor and the processor very quickly. So the sensor on both of these cameras is 45.7 megapixels. At the time the D850 came out, it was a revolutionary new CMOS backside illuminated, or BSI sensor, which meant that you got lots more light trapping capabilities essentially.
Wow, Becky, but if they're the same resolution, why shall I upgrade to Z8?
Okay, so the Z8 has new sensor technology. It is a stacked CMOS BSI sensor in this case.
Z8, while the resolution is the same, has a stacked sensor, which means the readout from the sensor for the data is much, much faster. What that means, first of all, no blackout. Second of all, much higher frame rate. And third of all, for video work, because readout is much faster, you won't see that jelly effect when you, let's say, pan in or zoom in the camera.
Yes. The processor is the X-Speed 5 in the D850, which at the time was cutting edge. With the Z8, it's the X-Speed 7, just the same as it is in the Z9. If we get into autofocus a little bit, because a lot of you will be asking about autofocus, the D850 has essentially a similar focusing system to the D5, which was the flagship body of its time. The Z8 has an exactly the same focusing system as the Z9, with a few extra advantages at the time of release.
What does it mean? Well, technically, if we look at the DSLR design, so you got this little mirror over here, and then when the light goes through the lens, it goes up to the viewfinder, some of it, and then you see the image, but also, because the mirror is kind of half translucent, it also will go down and fall down to the AF sensor. So autofocus sensor is not on the sensor itself, and that's why we talked about sharpness of the images. So, but also what it does as well, because it's small, it doesn't actually cover the whole sensor or the whole viewfinder. Normally, what you look through the camera, you'll see a kind of a frame within the viewfinder where all those focusing points are. So keep in mind that while it has 153 focusing points, only 99 of them are cross-type, which means those are the fast focusing points. And if you use any non-cross-type focusing points, it will struggle in places like low light, and the lens may have. Now, the autofocus sensor on Nikon Z9, as well as all other mirrorless cameras, is actually installed on the sensor itself. And because you don't have a mirror, so you can install it this way, and that covers the whole area of the sensor. All those points are cross-type as well, which means you're autofocusing not only for day use, but for very high frame rate use, let's say where you need super fast autofocus for fast moving subjects, but also low light use. You'll notice a massive difference in terms of performance between the two cameras. In real world, it just means it will hunt less, it will keep the object sharp without going out of focus for quite some time.
Another improvement in Z autofocus capabilities is the fact that we now have AI in our cameras. That means simply that the Z8 can detect up to 9 different types of subject, whereas the D850 has your old standard DSLR type focus detection modes. We've got single, continuous, we've got 3D group focus points, etc.
I can't see AI inside.
You can't see the little AI guy, the little artificial intelligence. So although for most day-to-day photography, you may be quite happy with a single focus point in the middle, you focus, you recompose, or perhaps you move your focus point around inside that bracket. With the Z8, you can pretty much point it at any subject and the camera can decide what to focus on.
Absolutely. So if you're a seasoned photographer and you've been using DSLRs or even film SLRs for quite some time, this is one of the best autofocus system available on those cameras. So in terms of this, you will be quite happy. Now, obviously, new generation of cameras like Z9 and Z8 will make your photography a lot easier to shoot. Effectively, you've got face recognition, you've got eye recognition, which works really well. You can set it to animal detection, airplane detection even, modes. And then the camera will effectively look into those scenes and detect the objects, which makes life a lot easier. For example, if you're a wildlife photographer, you can just keep your earphone button tracking the subject all the time and just press the shot when you need to. You'll track it really, really well. Well, with this camera, you would actually need to keep your focusing point on a subject most of the time and allow, let's say, set as some sort of dynamic or 3D tracking mode just to allow to track it either by color or by certain area. But it does require more skill for capturing fast-moving subjects on DSLR compared to mirrorless cameras.
Speaking of moving subjects, let's touch on frame rate because it's kind of a big deal. The D850 had two options with a special sort of bonus option. We had up to 1 to 6 frames per second in continuous low speed, and then we had 7 frames per second in continuous high-speed shooting. You could add the NBD12, put in a special battery from the D5, which is the ENEL 18. You needed a special tray for it and obviously the charger for it, so it all became very, very expensive. But you could get up to 9 frames per second. This did affect how much storage you had in your buffer, but also was very dependent on what memory cards you were using. So in a nutshell, up to 9 frames per second if you really wanted to push it. The Z8 shoots 1 to 10 frames per second in continuous low shooting, and then 10 to 20 frames per second in continuous high speed. So you can get up to 20 frames per second as it is. You can push that between 30 to 120 frames per second, but you can't shoot in RAW.
That's true. And because the camera came out very recently, in terms of technology, again, it's a lot more faster. So D850 would give you 51 shots on 14-bit RAW before the buffer fills up and stops recording to the memory card. This one is effectively will be infinite if you're recording to CF Express card. And obviously SD cards will have its limitations because of the slower recording times. But also if you use formats like high efficiency RAW, which is available on this camera, is effectively infinite. You can effectively take an hour burst and it will still keep shooting, which is incredible if you are sports and action photographer.
Another nice added bonus for the Z8 is because it's mirrorless, you can actually pre-record images. So in JPEG mode, the camera can start taking images as soon as you start to half press that button, which can be very, very handy if you're shooting an action sequence.
Again, the feature that we lived without pretty much till like last few years, but it is there now. It makes your photography life a lot easier if you want it to be.
Now let's talk about image quality. They do have the same 45 megapixel sensor, but not all sensors are created equal.
While on low ISOs, they will perform pretty much the same, and in terms of, let's say, color reproductions, they're going to be similar, with some people preferring D850, some people preferring Z8. Now, on higher ISOs, again, there's a very little difference in terms of low light performance. Technically, Z8 will perform slightly better, but we're talking about very little difference.
One thing I would add to that, though, is that the advantage of the Z body is that you now have access to essentially some of the best lenses that Nikon have ever made. F-mount glass is beautiful. And if you're starting to consider upgrading, then obviously you can use all your f-mount glass on the Z8 via the FTZ or FTZ2 adapters, and there's no problems there. But side-by-side tests have shown that the Z lenses do tend to outperform in terms of sharpness, rendering, and also focusing speed. So if you kind of want to go for the latest and greatest, then you have access to all those extra lenses. Shall we talk about video?
Well, if you talk video, the answer is very simple. Z8 is much better camera for people who shoot a little bit video or a lot of video. While D850 can shoot at 4K up to 30 frames per second, the autofocus on D850 in a live view mode feels archaic, and this is to do with a camera effectively using two different autofocus modes. It uses autofocus sensor for standard optical viewfinder shooting, and it uses autofocus on the sensor itself for the live view, and it is very, very slow. Z8 has no difference in autofocus performance, either for still photography mode or for video work. So you get all those benefits of face recognition, eye recognition, all the tracking capabilities available in this camera. Nikon Z8 also shoots 8K at 60 frames per second and can also record 4K at 120 frames per second. This is something that you won't get on D850. So I would say, if I would use D850 for video, I would genuinely pre-focus and would try to keep my camera still. That's all I would do. With the Z8, I can run and gun and it will get really good autofocus performance during the video in any situations. Also, because of the stacked sensor, you don't get that jelly effect compared to D850. So if you do a lot of panning, you will notice a massive difference. Or let's say you got a train passing by, those lines are not going to be straight. And that's just to do with the reading speed from the sensor, where it goes from the top to the bottom of the sensor. One thing about the video as well, because it's effectively a mini Z9. So it has all those new features that Z9 introduced for videographers, which is really good. Because of a cheaper price, it becomes a truly hybrid camera. It allows a much better run and gun setup, especially for gimbal use because of the lights compared to Z9. And that's something that I wouldn't use D850 for.
And that's a very simple comparison for you without even getting into the fact that we have NRAW, we have ProRes. There are so many different options catered specifically for videographers with the Z8, whereas the D850, although it was cutting edge at its time, still feels a little bit more like an afterthought for videography use.
Yeah, so if you still shoot it, absolutely fine. If you're a video shooter, definitely Z8 is a huge boost over D850.
Yeah. Now let's talk about price. The Z8 at time of launch is £3,999 or thereabouts, equivalent in dollars and euros as well. Whereas the D850 now hits around 2,800. So it's a big difference in price.
Absolutely. And knowing that you can pick up D850 secondhand as well at a cheaper price, well, a lot of people upgraded from this to this, or the Nikon Z9, then definitely it's something to consider when buying a new camera. So if you haven't got a camera already, and you're still thinking between the two cameras, I think it just comes down to the use. All right, Becky, so where D850 will perform as well as Z8, and where Z8 do you think will outperform D850?
I would say if you are mainly a stills photographer, if you do landscape, fine art, stationary subjects generally, then I don't think you're going to see a huge difference between the D850 and the Z8. In fact, if you're an interior photographer or something like that, then you've got lenses in the F mount that aren't yet available in the Z mount, and you'd have to adapt them. So for those situations, the D850 is still going to be the perfect choice.
Yeah, so basically, if you don't need a super fast autofocus of Z8, autofocus of D850 was one of the best at its time. So in terms of this, it will perform really well, where it will struggle maybe low light conditions or when you track in subject, which is moving really, really fast. Now, basically everywhere else, Z8 will be a better camera at a higher price. So keep that in mind. You get all the best Nikon Z native lenses. You can use all your F-mount lenses as well. So when you upgrading the camera, you may just keep your lenses to start with and use it via FTZ adapter and then get the native glass. But overall, Z8 is a better camera. But looking at the time of release, there's about 5-6 years difference between the camera. Yes, technology hasn't advanced so much, so this camera is a lot snappier. Okay,
so let me ask you the question. Is the Z8 the true Z replacement for the D850, would you say?
I would say yes to probably 99% of all people, but there's always 1% like me who would want to have a slightly higher resolution. But just including at the amount of tech included in this camera and just performance boost over D850, I would say definitely yes.
Great. We hope you found that comparison useful. If you did, please give us a like and a subscribe, and we'd be fascinated to know what you think in the comments below.
And if you found this super useful, there's super thanks button as well, so hit it if you can.
Nice.